Buddy, so everybody knows that Canada's hotspot is Lytton, BC, right? Now, I was really nice at the opening. I'm not going to be so nice now. So we always known that the weather impacted the Fraser Canyon. And so we knew that the hot weather was, but I don't think what people realize though is that in 2019, we had a weird wind event, and they call it a Spanish word called a Del Reco. It lasted approximately 5 minutes and it ripped roofs and car patios off. So this is in August of 2019. And the reason why it was weird is because the wind came north-south, lasted 5 minutes, and was not recorded by the Lytton weather station because it was set to a certain elevation. So it was a wall of fast traveling wind that lasted only seconds. Then we heard about the heat dome, which I spoke to, that said that, okay, we hit 49.6. And that's because, again, that same weather station isn't in the right location, but most of Lytton's weather, everybody's data showed at 55. Then we had the atmospheric river that just wiped out everybody. And then the rain hadn't even stopped falling. And then we had minus 32 and got 4 feet of snow. So when we talk about compounding effects, this is one part of British Columbia, just hammered. And yet look at this, right? Because our philosophy was that, a stitch in time saves 9. An ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. So Lytton and Kanaka realistically and honestly is a tale of two cities. You've got my home community of Kanaka who made a decision years ago to invest in their tomorrow today. And as a result, we're able to minimize the consequences on a community 14 kilometers south of Lytton. Lytton itself is 17 months later, still cleaning up, right? Because the atmospheric rivers and all that, it's just an amazing story. And one of the challenges, of course, is that the ability of our federal and provincial governments to respond in a timely fashion. And I dare say, with not a lot of empathy. It's because everybody was overwhelmed. It was such a big event. So what Kanaka did though to prepare our community is we're working with the federal and provincial governments and the regional governments as well, but we're not waiting. One of my sayings at Kanaka was that I'll gladly accept your money after COD, but I can't wait to get your approvals to do the things that are necessary to give my future generations a chance. So we're using our revenues and hopefully finding partnerships after the fact saying, look, I'm happy to accept, let's say $15,000 to our solar project. It was up and running last fiscal, but you know what, I'll still take your money this fiscal. So there is money out there. The hardest part is how do we work with a government that is hardwired to slow? So I'll leave it there just saying, okay, because I'm really looking forward to seeing what everybody else has to say, what the challenge is. Thank you.
So here I am again having problems. Next, we would like to hear from Twyla. Go ahead.
All right, I'm going to try and share my screen. I just had a couple pictures to show. So some of my background, I used to work for the city of Calgary. So I'm currently at Associate Engineering, but with the city of Calgary, I was a big part of the flood in 2013. And so these are just a few photos that we have. But I'd say around resilience planning, one of the key things for a local government is also understanding the context across the entire spectrum of emergency management. So the huge importance around really detailed preparedness planning made a huge factor in terms of how we responded. So I was part of about 2 years of work prior to the flood of completely overhauling the response planning and the river models and the maps and the data. And that is so critical in terms of the response. It was also key through recovery phases. So through that, also pointing out Calgary is still in recovery. So there's the immediate push of getting people back into the homes right away, getting critical infrastructure back in. There was a tagline in Calgary of come hell or high water, we've got to get back to Stampede in 2 weeks. And so I think this resilience piece of trying to put more resilience in during recovery is really complicated unless you have those plans in place already. As I moved into climate adaptation planning for the water utility and now continue that at Associated, I actually see a huge importance of our resilience planning really connecting to some of the lessons learned in our emergency planning and bringing those groups of people together And that can be quite siloed in terms of strategic planning, long-term plans, and the emergency response, but also silos that come in different disciplines, so starting to get everybody to think together. So some of the photos I have here on the left, this one I kind of laugh about. So I was called the map girl by Mayor Nenshi. I was running around with my inundation maps and my Sharpie markers, but even things such as I couldn't get to the airport in time because the roads were full of people trying to see the flood. And so there was a huge amount of communication for people to please stay home. And so this helicopter landed right in front of our office building so I could get in and go and look at some stuff. Other things on the top right, City of Calgary now has a stockpile of emergency riprap, realizing that we ran out of riprap as we're trying to stop some of the erosion in critical sites. Don't worry, that was cleaned up, but there aren't parking concrete barriers there anymore. There's actually a bio-demonstration site for bioengineering. But some of the learnings that come from some of these events in terms of having stockpiles of material on site, pre-communicating about people staying home. Another picture on the side around debris, just huge volumes of debris, having to go out and clean that up at the water intakes, things like that. So there's been a lot of evolution of the emergency response plan coming out of that, which is also connecting to a lot of the investments and some of the upgrades as well. And on the bottom right, that's a picture of the water coming into one of the treatment plants during the flood, and we were able to treat that water and still have safe drinking water. And a big trigger for this was there was a much smaller event in 2005, and that was about a 20-year event. In 2013, it was about a 100-year event. And so that triggered the city actually do a PIVC study on their water treatment plants, and they invested in active flow. And so 2013, that system had just kind of come in, and this is the first test for it. And so I think that piece of, we need to start moving away from needing to have an event to trigger us to invest. But there's a really important piece of making sure those emergency pieces actually help really inform some of those adaptation planning pieces. And I'll leave it there and pass it along.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Matt.
Great. Thanks very much, Sahar. So my name is Matt Osler. I'm a senior project engineer at the City of Surrey and have been involved in flood management for 15 or 16 years now. For those that don't know, City of Surrey has the largest land base and in BC and the second largest population. So just wanted to share a few reflections on my career in the engineering department at the city. So the first few years were focused on implementing design standards for flood control in about a third of the city's floodplain. And we were very clear with the community that in a floodplain, it would be subject to flooding, and that protecting the land from complete flooding is impossible. And so that project was well underway when in 2010, the province released sea level rise guidelines. And that's when my work started to shift more into how we adapt to climate change. And we knew intuitively it would be a big issue for Surrey with a lot of low-lying area. But we wanted to do some homework, and we did a few years of detailed study. And we were really at a key decision point when we got those results wrapped up. And what we decided to do with the buy-in from our mayor and council was to really double down on a bottom-up approach to engage and outreach with the community and partners on how big of a challenge sea level rise would be for the city. So we did that for a few years. And then we were very fortunate in 2019 to receive one of the largest federal government grants through the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund to put some of the early actions that came out of that comprehensive engagement with our community on what to do about sea level rise into action. And that's really been the story of the last 3.5 years for me, is trying to build the capacity to really accelerate our adaptation on the ground. And of course, it's been a big challenge for the city. It's the largest grant we've ever received from the federal government. And, the start of my career was focused more on building dikes, ditches, and pump stations. And now the switch is more on how do we make our infrastructure more resilient? How can we put new approaches such as nature-based solutions in play? doing things like secondary and tertiary lines of defense. So instead of trying to hold the water out right at the ocean's edge, how can we think about multiple layers of protection? So really a lot of lessons learned and opportunities that have come out of this most recent phase. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of this project, and along with Enda Murphy from the National Research Council, we were able to co-author an article for this project on coastal flooding. So thank you very much, Sahar, for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt. Graham, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. And I'm just going to share a couple of slides as well. How's that screen look?
Perfect. Go ahead.
Fantastic. So thank you. My name is Graham Watt. I'm Manager of Strategic Initiatives and Flood Recovery for the City of Grand Forks. Like Matt, I've been heavily involved in our own disaster mitigation and adaptation fund project the last few years, but come from a background of watershed planning and then community planning before our 2018 flood. Just a bit of context, I guess, to kind of look from a very large community to a small one. We're nested down along the southern border of BC, halfway between Vancouver and the Alberta border, and in the middle of a large transboundary watershed, really the focus of where the Kettle River and the Granby River come together at Grand Forks. So in May 10th, 11th, 2018, there was a massive flood, about a 200-year flood, 0.5% chance flood that hit the city and the region overall. And this was a major impact for the community. You know, there was 1,500 households evacuated, 400 houses damaged or destroyed, very large impacts on industry, critical infrastructure in the core of our community. This is looking through the North Ruckle neighborhood, which is a partly low-income community between the industrial area and downtown and the Kettle River under the bridge in the midground there, and one of the heavily impacted houses. Just want to draw your attention to this manufactured home right here, where water was nearly to the top of the window. So this is what translates now into at least 3 meters of flood depth. So in 2018, we were presented with the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund opportunity when we were just starting our flood recovery. So we had stood up a 12-member community recovery organization, really largely based within the community. 5 partner organizations came together, and there was a really large focus on wellness, housing recovery, critical infrastructure, environment, and economic recovery. But all of a sudden, about 2 to 3 months after the flood, we were doing risk assessment and analysis in preparation for having this submission to Infrastructure Canada and the province. So a large part of our recovery effort ended up being about getting feedback on a very impactful flood mitigation program and some really hard decisions around where the dikes would and wouldn't be put, and ultimately managed retreat or a portion of the community being returned to the river. And that's that North Ruckle neighborhood, which we saw in the previous photo right here. So what that looked like from an impact within the community of a flood impact that, here you see North Ruckle, the industrial area with the Interfor and Rockwool, and the downtown area. So this is kind of the design flood scenario with the kind of the core of the city as well, really impacted, as well as other areas outside kind of rural neighborhoods. Going to dikes that protect neighborhoods, industrial area, and downtown. And that means the return of this large area to the floodplain ultimately allows for the river to expand and spread out within this area, and helps offset some of the impacts of the hydraulic impacts of water backing up because of the new dikes, as well as impacts of our new riprap in the stream, a new offset wetland for that area. So ultimately, I just want to reflect at this point, and for comments coming up about challenges for small communities and resources and that kind of thing, for a community of 4,000, both recovery and mitigation overtook everything we did. And it ultimately, presented a lot of trade-offs and a lot of challenges, and in a lot of ways, I'm not sure which ones we were ready for and which ones we weren't. And so I think the context for climate impacts equity, the previous panel was fantastic. The infrastructure challenges that we talked about, it all kind of comes together. So thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. It's amazing to have such a panel we couldn't get closer to impact and action. All of you have been experiencing firsthand both dealing with the impact of a disaster, maybe in exception of Matt. Well, even you last year, Matt, you've been dealing with the direct impact, but also hands-on action, both response, recovery, and risk mitigation. It's wonderful to have you. So would like to start, actually, before I start with my question, I want to invite the audience to start asking if they have questions, to put it in the chat, so we can also pick up on your questions from the chat. But I would like to start with my first question, and that's, I would like to hear from you to describe, based on your experiences, the challenges that you've been facing, your communities have been facing in building resilience that is rooted in the governance at local level, especially for integrating climate and disaster risk management into various elements of development planning. Can I go first with Matt? Would you like to start first?
Yeah, for sure. So just, thinking about what some of the governance issues are with implementing disaster risk reduction. And I think a big one that we've run into is having, in Surrey, we have a lot of other infrastructure owners and providers, like Ministry of Highways. We have major transmission corridors for gas and for electricity. And what we haven't seen so far is a really strong risk reduction mandate from any of really most of the other agencies. And so that makes it difficult for Surrey, where we are accountable to our residents who want to see progress on this front. But really a lot of the local issues are actually much more complex, involving regional and provincial partners. And in terms of how we can overcome that, I think really getting that awareness and sort of political support to really shift the mandate of organizations to consider and prioritize disaster risk reduction.
Thank you. Graham, would you like to go next? I know you have had also concerns and issues related to infrastructure, but feel free to talk beyond that. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. And I think focusing, there's several aspects to governance, of course, that are challenging in small communities with climate adaptation and risk reduction. But one of the big things that with funding, sometimes it's largely reimbursement based, and being a small community with, typically a $13 million total budget, including our electrical utility, we normally only spend $2 to $4 million on capital projects in any given year. And now we're at about a $2 million per month burn rate on our major projects. So the province in its funding supported us with a large upfront payment, which is massively important. The federal government is largely based on reimbursement. And sometimes the mismatch of maybe the design of an infrastructure program like DMAF to actually doing something like managed retreat as part of a flood mitigation program, there's a lot of learning curves, a lot of kind of hiccups along the way, and even the funding itself wasn't designed for acquiring homes. It was only designed for acquiring land in support of infrastructure. And so I'll get a little bit more into that gap, I think, in further part of the conversation, but definitely a big kind of maybe a governance mismatch and challenge there.
In how the financing mechanisms are basically designed, not necessarily aligned with the level of challenges you're facing on the ground. Twyla, would you like to go next, commenting about governance challenges at local level?
Sure. I think from a governance thing that I'm seeing is there's a time and a place for a bottom-up approach, but there really needs to be a lot more clarity and direction from top down. And so I think things like targets, whether they're at a municipal level or up to provincial and up to national, hoping the new national strategy has some guidance there, but being really clear on what you're trying to achieve. And so I think, how you define resilience or what you're trying to achieve in a project, you're seeing that really vary across the municipality, at least in bigger ones like Calgary. And so I think having to have a much stronger guidance of what those outcomes are, what we're trying to achieve, will get everybody on the same board. So I think that's a key one around targets and defining your outcome. I'm seeing that also on some design guidelines and standards documents that I'm working on nationally, that we also tend to not want to be prescriptive around climate, which we understand there are differences on how you may want to address it. But I think we tend to have very broad statements around needing to consider climate or needing to consider resilience. And I think there is a little more rigor that we need to be more specific about. And again, that piece of, we need to push ourselves to actually take some much bigger steps. And I think at a local level, kind of building on what Matt had said there and others, it's really difficult at a local level to maybe take a big step forward in terms of your budgets, or your citizens are right there. There needs to almost be a collective permission space where they're kind of moving together, because they're not necessarily getting that push, at least in Alberta, from the provincial government or federal. And so I think to really make big steps in resilience, there needs to be either strong mandate at a higher level, or kind of a collective moving forward together and kind of demonstrating we can do this. But if it's one municipality on its own really trying to make a big step, that's a really difficult situation to be in.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Patrick, would you like to comment on governance challenges?
Yeah, governance. So a big part of Kanaka's story is that in 2015, we created a land use plan, and it created a vision statement called, we wanted to become a self-sufficient, sustainable environment community. But that process of creating that land use plan actually made us realize that we lived in a dangerous world of assumptions, that there was always going to be water, food, and shelter, and transportation, and energy. So we realized, so what it did was kickstarted what's called a climate change adaptation plan. And we realized that our community was extremely vulnerable to extreme weather events. And the chances of the federal and provincial governments or anybody coming in and saving us was slim. So I think what we realized first was assumption. And then we wanted to work together to establish physiological stability. So in one of the videos I posted, in the chat room, I said, okay, so with a mandate from the community, after community engagement as a government, I was told this is what you need to do, and in this order. How you find the money, that's up to you. And I take heart that that message is sort of getting through. For example, recently our provincial government has decided not to build a museum. So that's important. So a museum is important, but not as important as climate change preparedness and adaptation. And the one that really blew me away in the last 2 days was our provincial government has decided not to support another Olympics. It almost like they have a plan to help people out in Grand Forks or in Lytton. It's too soon to say because we won't know till what's really coming till after November 12th, but I'm hoping that it'll speed up. So the challenge was getting the mandate and getting the priority, finding the funding. We're using our monies to build this, but reaching out and working positively with the federal and provincial governments. We have a little weakness in philanthropy and in, I think it's financial institutions, because guess what? Climate change resiliency's business case isn't very good. How do you convince a financial institution to give you a massive amount of dollars for something that won't generate profit? So there are some massive challenges, but by becoming the desire to become dependent, what is it? Self-determining again is what drove our community into investing into climate change resiliency. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. There's a lot in there that we can diverge and talk about. Like part of it is the value base that we are using for our decision making. As of now, all the decisions are made based on economic gain as the main criteria for decision making, whereas life safety and peace and security can change how we make the decisions. But we will not go there for this panel because we have other questions to address. A few of you already kind of touched on the challenges that financing mechanisms are kind of putting on the local level. And this is one of the feedbacks and recommendations we had in the report, that we need proactive financing mechanisms that are reliable, sustainable, predictable, and risk-based, but also designed based on the needs of local level. Is there any further comments you want to add to that? Graham, go ahead, please.
Sure. And Patrick, thank you about your comment about climate resilience not being profitable. I think maybe how it could be reframed is that not doing it will cost way more. And so if there's some way of kind of financializing that reduction in risk, there'll be, you know, funding knocking down the doors. I'm hoping at some point there's a reason for hope somewhere in there. One of the gaps for us, ultimately funders said that property could be acquired at current fair market value. And this was a year after a devastating flood where the buyout area for the flood mitigation and floodplain naturalization took property values from 250,000 down to less than 100,000 in many cases. And so, you know, how was this? It was the opposite of equity. It was impacting those who had lost the most. And so council for the city took it on our own taxpayer amount to basically up the funding so that additional compensation, some of which would have normally been enabled through expropriation, but additional compensation could help make up a bit of the gap and also help make sure people weren't in negative equity after their mortgages was paid out after the buyout. So if people had a $20,000 gap between the value of their house and the value of the mortgage, the additional funding that the city helped fund was to take them over that gap. That was a huge challenge, but it was like, this is something the community needs, but how do we at least financially try to address some of those disparities left when you look at the situation? So I guess the challenge to funders is how do you look beyond fair market value and look, you know, perhaps at other jurisdictions where what does it cost to get somebody reestablished outside of a buyout area? You know, equivalent compensation for what that looks like. How do we actually look at what their wellness needs are in transitioning, especially if they've got you know, ability issues going on. A lot of the people impacted in our area were older, and there have been very bad health outcomes for some of the people in that community. So I guess that's kind of the one ongoing challenge that we are left with. But yeah, I want to pass that forward.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Anyone else would like to make additional comments about financing issues? Twyla, please.
Sure, I'll just kind of building on that. I think some funding programs need to be conscious that it may not be targeting what the top priority is for communities. So I think trying to leverage funding as it comes out, you know, based on the guidelines of that funding program, but it may actually really limit a community's ability to really address their highest vulnerabilities or risks. It can also affect the approach they may use. So if there's a lot of funding programs that are really targeted towards an infrastructure-based or kind of build-based solution, you know, how do we help better balance some of the needs, such as, you know, managed retreat and some other methods that are out there. And so I think just being careful about what funding and how it's directed is not always the most helpful for a local municipality. Also, the level of effort needed to support some of the funding. So you know, I know Calgary, there was one in particular and a few other people, but at least one person fully dedicated just to helping with keeping up with the DMAF and all the funding with a whole team of other people supporting. And so at a smaller community scale, that will be even more challenging to have the resources to prepare the applications and keep communications up.
Great point. Thank you. Matt.
Yeah, I just wanted to add as well that when a jurisdiction gets a big grant, it kind of creates a bit of a boom and bust cycle where you ramp up to really do a project, and then all of a sudden the funding's over, and then a lot of that momentum that you build disappears. So I think the big shift for making progress in this field is having a sustainable funding model where municipalities and regions can really look 10, 20 years out as to, okay, here's the size of funding that's available, here's the criteria, and then everyone can build their plans around that. Because I know for Surrey, it was definitely a challenge when we were coming up with our strategy, is we didn't even have any funding programs available when we started. So how do you make a plan when you don't have any sort of conception of what the budget should be, what the criteria will be used for determining whether it's funded. So I think that's a big takeaway for me.
Thank you so much. Patrick, would you like to comment about financing?
Well, financing is only 25% of the challenge, and you've heard it already. Every community, every person, every individual, every family, every government is dealing with HR, what do they call it? Resource deficiencies in people, time, technology, and money. So the question then is, how do you then prioritize the available resources? This is the challenge that as we undertook it starting in 2015. On the money side, one of the things here is that how do we quantify success, right? Lytton burnt and lost its water supply. Kanaka Bar did not. Lytton burnt and lost its electricity. Kanaka Bar did not. We stayed on during a climate change emergency. During the atmospheric river, many communities were stranded. Kanaka Bar was okay. So how do you quantify that? You're still on, you're still connected. It's because we invested in renewable energy generation at the community level. We invested in growing our own fruits, meats, fruits, and vegetables at the community level. And that was made available again to the region as it experienced its traumas. So what we have here then is money is important, yeah. One of the funniest things I like to say here is that if you guys look at some of the work that Kanaka has done, our business case for our economy is zero. That means our capital cost and our operating cost is covered. We're just not making any money. So our economy is able to continue on during crises because we've invested in resiliency or the ability to shelter in place. And so how do you quantify that? At least I'll still have money during an emergency to pay my mortgage. Whether or not you can pay your insurance proceeds, that's something else. And the one big gap I see when it comes to money, when it comes to emergency response, is the insurance companies. I'm not seeing them at the table as a big part of the conversation. They are greatly impacted by these disasters, and yet they're just silent. And so I will say this for Lytton, and it hurts me. Lytton had 10% insured, 47% underinsured, but 50% had no insurance. So I don't know how they're going to build back in any way, shape, or form if there was no insurance. And so when it comes to the insurance providers that are impacted by the Lytton fire, I've met one of them yet. I just haven't. And so I'm looking forward to the new mayor and council coming in on November 2nd, because one of the things I'm going to ask there is we need to bring the insurers to the table in Lytton, because they can help speed up the rebuild as opposed to finding financing from third parties. So again, thank you.
Thank you. Great, important point. So I would like to move to the next question, and that's about availability and access to harmonized and useful hazard, vulnerability, risk information, and climate data. What has been your experiences? And what would be your suggestions describing gaps and priorities to improve the situation? Twyla, should we start with you? Go ahead.
Sure. I'd say a big one around, from my experience anyway, is making sure that this hazard information is readily available to the public and able to be updated as it becomes available. And so, my experience in 2013, we had updated the model and had new maps, which is what we did in order to update our emergency response planning. But at the time, it wasn't public. So the official regulatory maps were public. But this information in the open houses that we had right after the event, people are in trauma. And so for us, it was, let's bring the information, let's show them this and explain what happened. And initially the pushback was, no, we don't want to, we can't share that information. And we did anyway, so got our hands slapped a little bit. But I can say that every single person that I talked to, they may not have gone away happy, but they went away a little more calm, because they understood that we could explain to them what was happening. Right, we could show them all the, because there was a lot of like, oh, Bob did this in his yard and he caused it. And it's like, no. Like the fact that we could come and show all of this modeling and show how, it developed over different size floods. It also gave them the confidence that they had a team of people that were working on this at the city, and they they felt better. So I think that kind of helped trigger the ability for Calgary to actually share all of their flood maps for various different sized events on their website with the flood map and story, and the communication piece around it is important. But given that context, we had a new model pre-flood. We had to redo the whole thing after. So great data set for researchers out there on soil movement. But those regulatory maps are still not updated. We still have our maps from the 80s in our land use bylaws. And so that mapping is there with so it's provincial jurisdiction, work with them. But it's the policy piece that's slowing down the ability to get this information out. And we know the policy of what does this mean for areas that are now in the floodway or in the flood fringe. We know that's critical, but in the absence, we're not sharing this information. I think we need to make this publicly available so that people are actually aware.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Graham, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. A small story, kind of also thinking about those historical floodplain maps and our current floodplain maps. Historically, it was a provincial federal agreement that in the early 90s for our region, part of a province-wide effort to get everyone mapped. And it was a pretty decent mapping base. It provided a common kind of operating picture for flood management in BC and all the settled areas. And with the recent round over the last 5 to 6 years of various different funding programs, now we have a patchwork quilt that's mostly holes and the patches don't match up. And unfortunately, there hasn't been a coherent set of standards, funding mechanism, prioritization, or dissemination of the data. And I just, it wasn't a waste of money for us. The data is amazing, but I think we're missing the bigger picture because we don't have a good coherent picture. So thank you.
I remember in our conversation, Graham, in preparation for this event, you were also telling the story that there were 3 different hazard and risk assessments for flooding has happened. Could you share that story?
Yeah, so through 3 different funding sources over about 5 years within one watershed. So the boundary region of the regional district of Kootenay boundary is mostly within Kettle River watershed. And so City of Grand Forks has had, through our own projects, initial floodplain mapping update through urban systems, a further one through associated engineering in support of our flood mitigation program. And then the regional district has had one outside of the boundaries, working with Northwest Hydraulic. And a 4th company worked with 2 of the smaller municipalities on a different floodplain mapping project for Grinwood and Midway. And so far, none of the data is actually fully connected or meshing. And in some areas, there's an actual gap when you look at the boundary of a rural area and a city. So that can be confounding, of course, for emergency planning and community planning.
There's been a lack of standards for methodology and approaches, although I believe there is a new guideline, if my memory helps. Matt, would you like to comment on that? The hazard risk information and standards for methodologies.
Sure. Yeah, no, I can elaborate a little bit on some of the coastal challenges we face. So one thing that we're lacking a little bit is good local data on what is the rate of sea level rise here in the Lower Mainland. How are the windstorms changing over time? And so really thinking of data as really an asset and making sure that there's investments in collecting good data, because it's something you can't roll back the clock and say, oh, I wish we had 20 years of sea level data to be able to answer the question of, well, how much sea level rise have we seen in Surrey, for example? And then, of course, just really I wanted to emphasize the need for a mandate for open data to make sure that the data is publicly available, that it's machine searchable on the internet, because there's not a clear mandate in the case of, for example, coastal issues, like who's the one entity responsible for collecting data. And so as a local government, we've had to fill some gaps by setting up our own data stations, and then we rely on other agencies, and really just making sure it's all as available and accessible as possible for the long term.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And many of these issues are reflected, for example, in the coastal flood article that Matt and other have been prepared, and many other articles as part of the report. Patrick, would you like to comment on availability of hazard, risk, and climate information?
Oh, absolutely. Information is power, and we give it away for free. All you have to do is go onto our website and right-click and steal. We installed 3 weather stations equivalent to Minister of Environments. You need site-specific data. So we have 3 weather stations that measure what weather stations do. We have 12 operating solar projects that measure, again, temperature and solar efficiency. So you think about this. This is all generating site-specific data. Geez, God forbid, without the help of the federal and provincial governments, we installed water gauging stations in all of our streams. Why? Because water is life, and you need to know if you're going to have water tomorrow, so we're able to see the gradients. The problem with the atmospheric river was they wiped out our water gauging stations. So I can just say, though, back on November 15th, we had a lot of water. I may actually miss the cubic meters per second, but the point is site-specific data is critical, because as British Columbans, we want to know the truth. Do not patronize us. Do not condescend us. Tell us the truth. Am I in a fire zone? Am I in a heat zone? Am I in a wind zone? Am I in an extreme cold zone? Am I in a floodplain? Empower me. Give me the information to make the choice to stay and invest in resiliency or potentially move, because flooding is location-based. I'm saying is, if you built in a floodplain, duh, it's called a floodplain. So what are your choices? Invest billions of dollars into potential dikes. And Matt, I like what you said about secondary and third mechanisms. We may have to abandon some of the places we built on based on the forecasting and the data that's coming in. It's not going to get better. It's not going to get worse. So we might have to build up 10 or 15 meters above where we built now. So I think here that, you know, if we treat British Columbians not with kid gloves, give them the truth, it's going to be hard, because people have made long-term investment decisions based on yesterday's data, but they're also living in environments that was designed for yesterday's weather. And it's if we know what our choices are, then we can choose. During my opening, I said the Creator gave all of us life and choice. Give us the ability to choose our future, to invest or not. So I'll leave it there, just saying, yeah, baby, we've got a plan. And again, during my point earlier, with the passion and articulation I've heard on Friday and today, I know we're going to be in good hands. The only thing we need to do is get to your MLA and MP and make sure that climate change mitigation and adaptation and transition and all that sort of stuff is at the top of their radar. Because for gosh sakes, there are elected officials, and climate change is buried somewhere in between the too many left-footed shoes and something else. Climate change must become the priority for our decision makers. At least that's my view.
Wonderful.
So,
thank you. Go ahead, Twyla.
I just want to add a quick thing too, is on that is, you know, there are things that can be done at a local level, that knowing that there's just different jurisdictional things going on with mapping and information, but making that information known. So even in Calgary, when you go and develop in redevelop in a flood fringe zone or something, there is warnings that are now put on saying, you know, regulatory mapping gives you this elevation. However, based on the best information available, we recommend going here. And so even trying to integrate an ability to warn people, whether it's mapping online or when they come in for a development permit, that's kind of advanced. And in the vast majority of cases, people are designing to that higher level. And there's hesitation to share that initially, but people want the information and then they'll make decisions based on it. And so I think, yeah, there's different layers to get it out there, but we need to give it to people.
Great. Thank you so much for that point. So we are basically at the end of our panel. I would like to invite you for your final remarks. We all know that the status quo of how we've been doing things doesn't work, will not get us to the safe and resilient world that we want. What would be your one key recommendation to share with us for changing the way we do things? Matt, would you like to start?
Sure. So yeah, key recommendation would be, I think, to move forwards with a sustainable funding model that, as Patrick was saying, is going to recognize that we can't afford to do everything. We're going to have to make some really tough decisions on what we can and can't afford to do. And with climate change, it's here, it's costing us already. And so if we don't prioritize investment on it, it'll just cost us longer in the long term. And I think we're on the right track, but really need to accelerate our actions to keep up with the increasing hazard from climate change, and also from, in our region, the high rate of population growth in the region. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Graham.
Sure, thank you. Since you did ask for some imagination as part of this, reimagining this, thinking of the future as a beach ball, and it will sink if we don't inflate all three parts of it. We cannot do it, adaptation and climate resilience alone. The greenhouse gas mitigation and getting the net zero and all those kinds is absolutely critical. And it really rests on that foundation of the community planning, considerations of equity and also asset management, taking care of our infrastructure and not growing in ways that we can't even currently sustain, let alone with the costs of increasing costs due to climate adaptation and other challenges.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Twyla.
It's hard to end just on one. I'll keep it contained, but I will actually make a key connection to the previous panel, that the piece around equity and that social piece, I think, is a really critical lens for how we approach projects. And so that we need to get the most benefit we can out of a project. You may be going into, a flood project, for example, maybe there's localized stormwater flooding you're trying to manage, but making sure that every project we're stepping back and going, okay, well, what about urban heat? How do we integrate landscape into here? How do we look at our vulnerable populations and prioritize where we're doing these projects? And so I think, a big piece there is for us to always step back and think about, the variety of hazards, and that social equity, that kind of people-centric lens to things, I think really changes the approaches and enhances what we do.
Fantastic. Thank you. Patrick.
All right. Sorry, Matt and Graham, give me the thumbs up. If there's one thing that I would want, will you please invest in rural British Columbia? The most vulnerable places are our urban centers. If anybody is more prone to dumb and dumber, it's our urban centers. And yet for 10,000 years, every time the shitstorm happened, we moved from the rural to the urban. The urban's already at critical point. So we need to strategically invest in areas in rural BC, where you can still have water, food, shelter, energy, communication. And it's not that expensive to create these permanent facilities throughout BC, so that rather than, running where? Oregon, Washington State, Alberta, give us places where these beacons of safety are. And I'm just saying and it's not in Vancouver. Matt, you have a big road to hoe, but if we get hit with more atmospheric rivers, and coupled with a storm surge and a king tide, holy cow. But where's everybody from the Lower Mainland going to go during a catastrophic coastal event? They should go into the rural, but the rural doesn't have the infrastructure. Give it to us. We have the land. We have the willingness to be part of British Columbia. We are one common humanity, but we lack the resources. Don't be afraid to invest in rural BC. Have I got a place for you? You should watch some of the videos. I'm just hoping that the three of you, as well as Sahar, will consider moving to Kanaka Bar. Our first housing will be coming online in about 30 days, and our internet will always be on. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All the best to all of you. Thank you so much for being part of the panel. Shane, I pass it back to you. Thank you.
Scott, thanks.